In this lesson, we are going to be examining some classroom examples to decide the type and quality of skilled communication that is evident in the learning activity. Before we begin, let's recap by looking at the decision tree for skilled communication. The decision tree is built around 3 questions, and each question corresponds to a big idea in skilled communication. So the first question asks, if the learning activity requires students to produce extended or multimodal communication. Remember, the requirement is just for one of these criteria, extended or multimodal communication, not both. If the answer to this question is no, and students are not required to produce extended or multimodal communication, then the learning activity is coded as a 1. However, if the answer to this question is yes, students are required to produce extended communication or multimodal communication, then I need to ask myself 2 questions. Do the students have to provide supporting evidence, or do they design their work for a particular audience? If the answer is no to both of these questions, the learning activity is coded at a 2. But if the students do have to provide supporting evidence, or they have to design their communication for a particular audience, the learning activity is coded at a 3. Finally, if the students provide supporting evidence and design their communication for a particular audience, then the learning activity can be coded as a 4. As we said earlier, this decision tree can also be represented as a rubric. As you can see, each of the numbers 1 to 4 outline the criteria for the condition for that code. For example, to achieve a code 2, students produce communication which is extended or multimodal. You can decide which you find easier to use, the decision tree or the rubric, when you are coding the learning activities. We are now going to code a number of anchor lessons. It is important to note that these anchor lessons, which are learning activities, are not sample or model or exemplar lessons. Remember that these lessons have been deliberately selected to initiate discussion around learning design, and in this case, different forms of skilled communication. This is why they are referred to as anchor lessons, as they help anchor our thoughts around skilled communication ideas. We are not making judgments on how these lessons are designed. Neither should you be thinking about how you might have designed this learning activity differently. We are simply looking for evidence of skilled communication. Remember, these are not scores, but codes which describe the type of skilled communication present in the learning activity. To begin, please download the learning activity entitled Indigenous Cultures. When you have done this, please read it carefully. Then, make a decision about the level of skilled communication that you find in this learning activity. In deciding how to code it, you need to be able to point to evidence in order to justify the code you select. Remember, you are looking for evidence to support the code you are giving this learning activity, not making a judgment or grading the learning activity against what you think should have been done. Having examined the Indigenous Cultures learning activity, please indicate the code you assign this learning activity based on the evidence you found. We would encourage you to join the discussion where you can share your views on how you coded this learning activity. What code did you assign Indigenous Cultures? What evidence can you point to in order to substantiate your decision? The Indigenous Cultures learning activity can be coded as a 2. The students are required to produce extended communication or multimodal communication, but they are not required to provide supporting evidence or design their work for a particular audience. Where did we get the evidence for this code? If you look at the overview of what the children are asked to do over the course of the 6 days, you will see that they are required to do a number of different things as they engaged in learning about the Indigenous cultures. The learning activity does require multimodal and extended communication. As on day 2 and 3, the students are asked to research the Indigenous culture they have selected. Then on day 4, they are asked to draw a picture and write a paragraph which describes the land, climate houses and dress of that native people. However, the work the students are engaged in is descriptive, and there is no need to make any claims or provide evidence. Although they make a presentation on day 6, it will be based on the descriptive accounts they have researched and the pictures they have drawn. Now please download the learning activity entitled Design a Catapult. When you have done this, carefully read it. Then make a decision about the level of skilled communication that you find in this learning activity. In deciding how to code it, you need to be able to point to the evidence you find in order to justify this code. Again, you are asked to remember you are looking for evidence to support the code you are giving this learning activity, not making a judgment or grading the learning activity against what you think should have been done. Having examined the Design a Catapult anchor lesson, please indicate the code you are going to assign this learning activity based on the evidence you found. As before, we would encourage you to join the discussion where you can share your views on how you coded this anchor lesson. What code did you assign Design a Catapult? What evidence can you point to in order to substantiate your decision? The evidence indicates that Design a Catapult is a code tree. Students are required to produce extended communication or multimodal communication, and they are required to provide supporting evidence, as they must explain their idea or support a thesis with facts or examples. But they are not required to design their communication for a particular audience. The Design a Catapult learning activity can be assigned a code 3. The evidence to support this can be found on page 4 of the learning activity, which outlines the criteria for the lab report. The lab report is extended communication. Students are required to make a claim about levers and support it with evidence from their experiment. However, there is no specified audience other than the teacher as a grader, so the learning activity is coded at a 3. Finally, please download the learning activity entitled Doing Business in Birmingham. When you have done this, carefully read it. Then make a decision about the level of skilled communication that you find in this learning activity. In deciding how to code, you need to be able to point to the evidence you find in order to justify this code. As with the previous learning activities, please remember you are looking for evidence to support the code you are giving this learning activity for skilled communication, not making a judgment or grading the learning activity against what you think should have been done. Having examined the anchor lesson Doing Business in Birmingham, please indicate the code you assigned this learning activity. As before, we would encourage you to join the discussion where you can share your views on how you coded the activity for skilled communication. What code did you assign Doing Business in Birmingham? What evidence can you point to in order to substantiate your decision? The evidence points to a code 4 for this learning activity. This means that students are required to produce extended communication or multimodal communication, and they are required to provide supporting evidence, and they are required to design their communication for a particular audience. In this learning activity, students were learning about sustainable practices and how to affect change within their community. They had to build their own understandings of what sustainability was, work within their communities to find incidents of sustainable practices, and then inform the community about these sustainable practices. The evidence for a Code 4 at skilled communication is found by examining what types of products the students are asked to produce and the purpose these products are used for. Students developed extended multimodal communications for 2 purposes. They first created print brochures about sustainable practices to distribute to local businesses in order to solicit their participation. In addition, students then collected evidence on sustainability practices among local businesses and developed a wiki with audio-visual content to inform the broader local community. Now that you've examined a number of anchor lessons, you can see how the Skilled Communication rubric is a useful framework when designing learning activities in order to develop students' communication skills. In the next unit, you will examine a video case study of skilled communication in action,